This is a free course. No fluff, no nonsense. A direct and deep dive into the most powerful concepts of Carl Gustav Jung's psychology, with a clear goal to help you master your shadow and become emotionally unshakable. Who should watch until the end? Anyone facing anxiety, depression, feelings of guilt, anger, grief, or any type of psychological suffering. Those who already realize they are stuck, repeating self-destructive behavior patterns. Those who feel that no matter how hard they try, they cannot achieve the emotional control they desire. Those who carry pains they cannot name, but that weigh on them every day. This content is for you. Throughout this video, you will clearly and practically understand what the shadow is. You will learn how it silently shapes your feelings, thoughts, and impulses. You will discover why so many of the emotions you cannot control, outbursts of anger, anxiety attacks, unexplained sadness, chronic guilt, do not arise from external situations, but from unresolved conflicts within you. And more importantly, you will learn how to face all of this, not with superficial positive thinking techniques, but with a real, deep, and transformative method. A method based on over a century of deep psychology, teaching you to confront the most hidden parts of your psyche and integrate them. This is not a video for passive consumption. Pause when necessary. Take notes. Go back and watch again. Each concept presented here can change the way you understand yourself and how you deal with the world, but only if you apply it. It's not enough to just watch. It's personal work that requires courage. And yes, it will require discomfort. But on the other side of that discomfort is the emotional freedom you seek. You will learn why the repression of the shadow is at the root of many psychological disorders. How the persona, the mask you show to the world, contributes to your emotional fragility. How the archetypes of the collective unconscious manifest in your daily life, and how all this knowledge can be transformed into practical action. This is a complete course, a solid foundation for anyone wishing to start or deepen the process of individuation. The path that Jung described as the true purpose of human life, to become who you are. Now, if you really want to free yourself from the psychological suffering that accompanies you, if you want to be someone who can navigate the most difficult emotions without being destroyed by them, you are in the right place. But remember, only those who watch until the end and practice what is taught here will achieve real results. Let's get started. The shadow. This is the name that Carl Gustav Jung gave to the set of everything you reject, repress, or simply refuse to acknowledge in yourself. And this is where we truly begin this course, understanding what the shadow is and why it exerts such a devastating power over your emotional life. Imagine the following. Since childhood, you have been taught, by your parents, by school, by society, about what is acceptable and what is not. You were praised when you were nice, polite, obedient. You were criticized or punished when you showed anger, envy, selfishness, deep sadness, impulses considered ugly or wrong. And, like every child, you quickly learned. Certain emotions and behaviors need to be hidden, pushed into a dark corner of your psyche. This is how the shadow is born. But what happens to everything that has been repressed? It does not disappear. On the contrary, it remains alive, growing in the unconscious, shaping your reactions, your thoughts, your feelings. The shadow is the sum of all these denied aspects of the personality. It is the dark side that you do not want to see, but that inevitably acts upon you. Anxiety, often an indirect manifestation of the shadow. Depression, a buildup of unprocessed emotions trapped in the darkness of the psyche. Explosive anger, the cry of repressed parts that can no longer be ignored. Self-sabotage, an internal attack from the shadow itself against the conscious goals of the ego. The shadow is not evil in itself. It contains aspects that could, in fact, be sources of strength and creativity if integrated in a healthy way. But as long as it is not recognized, the shadow will continue to operate autonomously. And that is why so many people live trapped in cycles of emotional suffering that they cannot explain. They feel overwhelmed by uncontrollable emotions, by self-destructive impulses, by patterns of behavior that repeat like an endless nightmare. And here is the truth that few have the courage to face. You are not just the image you have built of yourself. You are not just your good side, your light side. You are also what you fear most to admit. And the more you run from it, the weaker you become emotionally. Integrating the shadow is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming whole. It is recognizing that anger, envy, fear, the desire for control, all of this is part of the human experience. And that only by bringing these aspects to consciousness can you prevent them from continuing to sabotage your life from the shadows. In the next few minutes, you will see even more clearly how the shadow is acting in your daily life, how it controls your emotions and reactions in ways you do not even perceive. If you think you are in control of your emotions, prepare for an uncomfortable revelation. In the next part, we will explore exactly how the shadow controls your emotions and your decisions, and why it is impossible to become emotionally unshakable while you do not understand this mechanism. Now that you understand what the shadow is, it's time to grasp how it impacts your life in a much more direct way than you might imagine, especially in your emotions and decisions. The shadow is not an abstract concept. It acts every day, shaping feelings, impulses, and choices. Jung explained that, as long as we do not make the unconscious conscious, it will continue to direct our life, and we will call it fate. This is the key to understanding why so many emotions seem to escape your control. You see, from a very early age, you were taught to repress certain feelings: anger, envy, fear, selfishness. You learned to hide impulses considered socially unacceptable. But what is repressed does not disappear. It remains alive, charged with emotional energy, acting autonomously through the shadow. When you feel an anxiety you cannot explain, you are often dealing with unrecognized shadow content. Similarly, disproportionate outbursts of anger, deep sadness without apparent cause, constant guilt, all of these are signs that the shadow is in control. In Psychology of the Unconscious, Jung warned, repressed contents do not cease to exist. They become autonomous forces that can invade and dominate consciousness at any moment. This explains why many emotional reactions seem to happen automatically. They are responses from unconscious complexes, fragments of the psyche that act under the command of the shadow. The decisions you make are also deeply influenced by this process, repeating toxic patterns in relationships, sabotaging professional opportunities, adopting self-deprecating attitudes. All of this is fueled by shadow content that you have not integrated. As long as you believe you are in total control of your emotions and choices without first facing your shadow, you will be living an illusion. Your shadow does not disappear just because you ignore or rationalize your emotions. On the contrary, it strengthens in the darkness. But the good news is that there is a way out of this cycle, and it begins with awareness. Identifying the patterns of the shadow is the first step to regaining emotional control and truly becoming a resilient and whole person. However, there is a fundamental obstacle that prevents most people from starting this journey. The persona, your social mask, built to please, to protect, to fit in, ends up reinforcing the dominance of the shadow. Now pay close attention, because this is important. If you've made it this far, you're probably asking yourself, how can I actually apply all of this in my life? Because knowing, just knowing, changes nothing. What transforms you is practice. And that's exactly why I created my new ebook, Dialogues with the Unconscious, a 30-day path to individuation. This is not an ebook to just read and forget. It's a 30-day practical guide with simple yet powerful daily exercises that you can do in just a few minutes each day. You don't need hours of free time. You just need daily commitment. Every exercise is designed to help you connect with your unconscious and start integrating your shadow in a consistent, practical way. And this ebook is the perfect complement for those who have read or will read Beyond the Shadow. If Beyond the Shadow is the map, Dialogues is the day-by-day path to help you apply this knowledge in real life. And listen, it's currently available with a 10% launch discount, but that won't last long. If you're truly committed to doing this work, don't put it off. Click the link in the pinned comment and get your copy right now. Start your practical journey of transformation today. To understand how the shadow maintains control over your life, it is essential to comprehend the role of the persona, the social mask you have built to survive and adapt to the world. Jung describes the persona as a system of adaptation or relationship with the external world. In other words, it is the image you present to be accepted, respected, or loved. It is not who you truly are, but who you have learned to appear to be. Since childhood, you notice that certain behaviors generate approval, while others lead to punishment or rejection. Naturally, you learn to emphasize the pleasing aspects and hide those that are not. Over time, this adaptation crystallizes. You wear the persona like armor, an idealized version of yourself that you carry into relationships, work, and social life. But here lies the problem. Everything you repress to maintain this mask ends up being pushed into the shadow. The more rigid and perfect the persona, the more psychic material accumulates in the darkness of the unconscious. Therefore, people who seem extremely controlled, always positive, and impeccable in public often struggle in secret with deep states of anxiety, depression, explosive anger, or a suffocating sense of emptiness. The price of sustaining an idealized persona is extremely high. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung warns, the persona is a compromise with society, but also a self-deception, as it distances us from what we truly are. The more you believe you are your persona, the more disconnected you become from your authentic self, and the more vulnerable you are to the manipulations of the shadow. This internal conflict generates constant emotional fatigue. You expend energy trying to maintain an artificial image while repressed aspects of the psyche demand attention. It is a game that cannot be won. The shadow will always find ways to manifest, whether through physical symptoms, emotional crises, or impulsive behaviors. The solution? Start dismantling that mask. Recognize that you are not the persona. You are a whole human being with lights and shadows. Integrating these aspects is the only way to achieve true emotional freedom. And the first step toward that is learning to identify the elements of your shadow. How does it manifest in your daily life? How can you begin to notice your hidden patterns? This is exactly what you will discover in the next part. Now that you understand how the shadow and the persona interact, it's time to take a crucial step, learning to recognize your shadow in everyday life. Jung made it clear that the shadow reveals itself whenever we are dominated by intense and irrational emotions. In Ion, he writes, the shadow appears in impulsive reactions, in lapses of behavior, in the projections we make onto others. In other words, you don't need to enter a cave to find the shadow. Just pay attention to your own daily reactions. Here are some practical examples. Imagine you feel a sudden and disproportionate hatred for someone at work. Something small, a comment, a gesture, triggers a rage that you yourself consider exaggerated. This is a clear sign of projection. What you're hating in that other person is, in fact, a repressed aspect of yourself that you refuse to accept. Another example. You disdainfully judge people who show emotional vulnerability, saying they are weak or dramatic. But if you look deeper, you might realize that you yourself have repressed your sensitivity for years, out of fear of being seen as weak. What you condemn in others is what you cannot tolerate recognizing in yourself. Situations like envying someone's success, feeling excessive guilt for small mistakes, having outbursts of jealousy, chronic procrastination, or avoiding important confrontations, all of these can be expressions of the shadow. In Man and His Symbols, Jung and his collaborators emphasize that dreams are one of the most direct ways to access shadow content. Recurring dreams with situations of loss of control, being chased, confrontations with shadowy figures or aggressive animals usually indicate that repressed content is trying to emerge. Another indicator: pay attention to your body. Chronic tension, unexplained pain, constant fatigue, these symptoms often reflect the psychic energy blocked by the attempt to keep shadowy aspects out of consciousness. Therefore, the key to recognizing your shadow is honest self-observation. Ask yourself, what irrationally bothers me in others? What emotions dominate me against my will? What behaviors do I feel ashamed of after they happen? What parts of myself do I hide to maintain my social image? This work requires courage. It is not comfortable to admit that you have anger, envy, fear, or cruelty within you. But as long as you do not recognize these elements, you will continue to be controlled by them. However, identifying the shadow is just the beginning. The next step, and the most challenging, is to consciously confront it. And for that, it is essential to understand how the process of confronting the shadow works, which you will discover in the next part. Recognizing the shadow is an essential first step, but true transformation happens in the confrontation. And here, Jung was categorical. There is no way to avoid this stage if you wish to become a whole individual. In The Undiscovered Self, he warns, individuation is not achieved by denying the shadow, but by confronting it with courage. But what does it mean in practice to confront the shadow? First, it is to accept that this process is uncomfortable and inevitable. You do not choose whether you will face the shadow. The only choice you have is whether you will do so consciously or continue to be manipulated by it. When you begin to bring these dark contents to light, intense emotional reactions arise. Guilt, shame, fear, anger. Many give up here, retreating back into the persona. But it is precisely at this moment that the real work begins. Here are some practical examples. You realize that you feel envy towards colleagues who achieve success. Your initial impulse is to deny or justify, "I don't care about that." But the true confrontation is to admit, without judgment, that envy is present. Asking yourself, where does it come from? What does it reveal about my own unacknowledged frustrations and desires? Or imagine that you have chronic difficulty in setting boundaries. In confronting the shadow, you realize that behind this pattern lies a deep fear of rejection and repressed anger for having been constantly disrespected in the past. Facing this anger, accepting it as legitimate, is part of the process. During this confrontation, it is common to go through several phases. Denial, the impulse to rationalize or minimize the dark aspects. Resistance, feelings of guilt or shame arise when admitting unacceptable parts of oneself. Acceptance, conscious recognition of these aspects as legitimate parts of the psyche. Integration, gradual assimilation of these contents, reducing their autonomous power. Jung emphasized that this journey is not linear. In Ion, he describes the confrontation with the shadow as a continuous process of assimilation, which accompanies the whole of life. There is no moment when you defeat the shadow. Rather, there is a constant commitment to dialogue and integration. Practical tools for this work include dream analysis, reflective writing, Jungian psychotherapy, deep meditation, and above all, the sincere willingness to look at oneself with brutal honesty. But be aware, during the confrontation, new psychic elements emerge. Deep archetypes residing in the collective unconscious begin to manifest, playing a crucial role in this process. In the next part, you will understand how the archetypes that emerge on this path, such as anima, animus, self, and trickster, can both accelerate and hinder the integration of the shadow. As you progress in confronting your shadow, something inevitable happens. Deep archetypes from the collective unconscious begin to emerge and influence your process. Jung dedicated extensive studies to these universal patterns of behavior and symbolic imagery in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, where he states, "Archetypes are universal, inherited psychic systems that act as organizing structures of experience." During the confrontation with the shadow, 4 archetypes often manifest with particular strength: anima, animus, self, and trickster. Each plays a fundamental role, sometimes as a guide, other times as an obstacle. Let's analyze each one with practical examples. Anima and animus. The anima, the unconscious feminine aspect in men, and the animus, the unconscious masculine aspect in women, are intermediaries between the conscious and the unconscious. In the process of integrating the shadow, these archetypes frequently emerge in dreams, emotional projections, and relationships. Practical example: a man in the process of individuation begins to have recurring dreams with mysterious feminine figures, seductive, dangerous, or wise. These images represent the anima, inviting him to integrate repressed emotional aspects. The same occurs with women regarding the animus, which may appear in dominating or inspiring masculine figures. Self. The archetype of the self represents the psychic totality, the organizing center of the psyche that transcends the ego. When the self emerges, there is usually a strong impulse to integrate internal polarities. But the self also confronts you with everything that has been denied, demanding conscious balance. Practical example: after months of working with the shadow, you begin to feel a new sense of internal unity and coherence. However, this comes accompanied by deep existential crises, questions about purpose, values, and identity. This is the self in action, forcing an internal reorganization. Trickster. Perhaps the most treacherous of the archetypes in this process is the trickster, the archetype of deception, chaos, and rule-breaking. On the path of individuation, the trickster often emerges when you believe you have overcome aspects of the shadow. It tests your ego, creating emotional traps and illusions of superiority. Practical example: after a period of significant progress, you start to think of yourself as more awakened or aware than others, and ironically, fall into a new form of self-deception. The trickster is at work, inflating the ego and obscuring the true inner work. In Ion, Jung emphasizes that archetypes are not contents of consciousness, but factors that organize and structure the psyche. Recognizing their presence and role is crucial for navigating the individuation process with clarity. Integrating the shadow is neither a linear nor simple journey. With each step, these archetypes emerge to guide, test, and transform you. Knowing how to identify them and engage in dialogue with them is one of the most important skills you can develop. But why is it worth facing all of this? Because the result of this work is a radical transformation in your emotional strength. In the next part, you will understand how the integration of the shadow strengthens your emotional intelligence, and why those who undergo this process become truly emotionally unshakable. After everything you've seen so far, it's natural to ask, why go through the hard work of integrating the shadow? The answer is simple, because the result is a profound transformation of your emotional intelligence and your ability to deal with life. Carl Jung made this clear in The Undiscovered Self. No transformation of consciousness can occur without parts of the unconscious, primarily the shadow, being brought to light. In other words, you do not achieve true emotional maturity until you face and integrate your shadow. But what does this mean in practice? Imagine someone who has spent their entire life struggling with outbursts of anger. After integrating the shadow, this person does not become a passive or indifferent being. On the contrary, they begin to recognize anger as a legitimate emotion, learning to express it consciously and proportionately. This makes them emotionally stronger, more whole. Another example, a person with a tendency towards social anxiety. Before working on the shadow, they avoided social situations, paralyzed by an irrational fear of judgment. By integrating the shadow aspects related to insecurity and the need for approval, they gradually begin to expose themselves to these situations with a new sense of self-confidence. These changes happen because by integrating the shadow, you reclaim parts of the psyche that were dissociated. This releases psychic energy that was previously consumed in repression. As a result, you become more authentic. You begin to act in a way that is more congruent with who you really are, and not just to maintain a persona. More emotionally resilient. Intense emotions no longer dominate you because you recognize them as legitimate parts of your being. Less reactive. By recognizing your own triggers, you stop projecting onto others what is yours. More whole. You accept yourself as a complete human being, with lights and shadows, which generates a profound sense of inner peace. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung writes, "The acceptance of the dark side of oneself strengthens the individual as they begin to relate more honestly and consciously to life." People who reach this level of integration become emotionally unshakable, not because they no longer feel difficult emotions, but because they are no longer controlled by them. They live with a sense of presence and stability that is rare in a world where most still flee from their own shadow. But how to apply this in everyday life? How to train your perception to keep the shadow integrated in daily life without falling back into old patterns? This will be the focus of the next part. Practical applications to cultivate a constant and deep state of awareness. Integrating the shadow is not a one-time event. There is no endpoint where you can say, "Okay, I'm done." Integration is a continuous process, and the real challenge is to keep that awareness alive in your daily life. How can you do this practically? First, it is essential to cultivate a posture of constant self-observation. In Psychology of the Unconscious, Jung writes that what is not brought to consciousness continues to happen as fate. This means you must train your perception to identify the moments when shadowy content tries to emerge, in feelings of irritation, envy, fear, and self-sabotage. Here are concrete practices you can adopt. 1. Conscious internal dialogue. Start paying attention to your automatic reactions. When you feel anger, envy, or shame, instead of repressing them, engage in an internal dialogue with these feelings. Ask yourself, what is this emotion trying to show me about myself? 2. Reflective writing. Set aside a few minutes each day to write about situations that provoked intense emotional reactions. By writing, you create a safe space to examine the contents of the shadow and reduce its unconscious power. 3. Dream analysis. As Jung emphasized in Man and His Symbols, dreams are direct gateways to the unconscious. Keep a dream journal. Observe recurring images, symbols, and characters, that evoke strong emotions. These are valuable signs of what the shadow wants to reveal. 4. Mindfulness. Mindfulness practices help develop present moment awareness, allowing you to observe your own patterns without identifying with them. This creates a space between impulse and reaction, which is essential for shadow integration. 5. Working with relationships. Use your relationships as a laboratory. Whenever you feel a strong dislike, blind admiration, or moral judgment about someone, investigate. Does this reveal something you do not accept in yourself? 6. Establishing internal and external boundaries. Learning to say no and set healthy boundaries is an essential practice for integration. Many shadowy contents arise when you constantly violate yourself to please or fit in. 7. Periodic review of the persona. Periodically ask yourself, what parts of me am I trying to hide behind my current persona? What aspects of my identity am I sacrificing to maintain a social image? Adopting these practices does not mean you will never again be caught off guard by shadowy content, but it means that when it happens, you will be better prepared to deal with it consciously, instead of being overwhelmed. With each cycle of awareness, the shadow's power over you diminishes. Your emotional intelligence strengthens. You become a more authentic, whole, and free person. But it is important to remember, this is a path that requires continuous commitment. The shadow is cunning. It adapts, finding new ways to hide. Therefore, the work of integration is a lifelong process. And to conclude this course, in the next part, we will reflect on why mastering the shadow is a one-way path, and what happens to those who choose to ignore it. Mastering the shadow is a one-way path, and this needs to be absolutely clear. Once you start bringing to light the dark aspects of your psyche, the emotions you avoided feeling, the thoughts you denied having, the impulses you deemed unacceptable, you can no longer pretend you don't see them. The comfortable illusion that you are just a being of light, a good person, someone who has overcome their weaknesses, crumbles. And what emerges in its place is not perfection, but a much more powerful truth, that of a whole human being, capable of recognizing their shadows, and precisely because of that, more free. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The function of the shadow is to compensate for the one-sided attitude of consciousness. Its assimilation leads to a psychic balance that cannot be achieved by any other means. In other words, without this work, you will remain unbalanced, vulnerable to the unconscious impulses that sabotage your life." Ignoring the shadow comes at a very high price. You may try to continue living behind your persona, projecting your fears onto others, judging what you do not accept in yourself, fleeing from uncomfortable emotions, but the cost will be ongoing psychological suffering, chronic anxiety, depression, compulsions, toxic relationship patterns. All of this thrives in the darkness of the unintegrated shadow. On the other hand, those who face this process seriously experience a profound transformation. You become emotionally resilient. You become less manipulable by others and by your own emotions. You begin to act with more authenticity and integrity. You gain an inner peace that does not depend on external approval. You learn to use even the dark aspects of your psyche as sources of strength and creativity. But don't be fooled. This does not mean that one day you finish the work. As Jung pointed out in Ion, the integration of the shadow is a process that accompanies the development of personality throughout life. New layers will emerge as you evolve, and the more you grow, the more capable you become of facing these new layers with courage and maturity. Therefore, this is not a path for the weak. It is for those who want to live consciously, for those who prefer truth over comfort, for those who understand that emotional freedom is only possible when you accept all of your humanity, and not just the part you would like to show the world. Now I want you to make a commitment to this process. In the comments write, I am willing to face my shadow. Just that. Putting this into words is a symbolic and powerful first step to affirm your intention to continue this path. And if this video resonated with you, don't stop here. Continue to the next video on the channel. It is an important part of your journey and will complement what you learned today. The shadow does not disappear, but you can become greater than it. Now, move forward.